Why is Scotland divided over independence? Members of the Scottish Parliament have voted in favour of the Scottish National Party, the SNP's calls, for another independence referendum. But why do some Scots even want independence? Well, for some very brief history, Scotland and England became somewhat joined in 1603 after the death of England's Queen Elizabeth I, that led to the accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne, and he became the king of both England and Scotland. But the two countries remained separate states until the passing of the Acts of Union in 1707, which officially united the two kingdoms, including Wales, into a Great Britain. At the time of this union, Scotland had already suffered major financial losses after the failed Darien scheme, which was an attempt at colonising present-day Panama. So it was believed that the union would stabilise the Scottish economy and provide access to trade across the British Empire. Now, despite the union, Scotland still kept many institutions separate, including its legal system, its education system, and its national church. Scotland also has its own language, culture, and national identity that have been preserved over the centuries, and as such, it is viewed by many as a distinct nation separate from the rest of the kingdom. The modern Scottish independence movement grew significantly in the 20th century, especially with the creation and the rise of the Scottish National Party, the SNP. The discovery of oil in the North Sea in the late 1960s only fueled the independence argument, with the SNP famously arguing it is Scotland's oil. They argued that these oil reserves would generate massive wealth for an independent Scotland and potentially the creation of a sovereign wealth fund similar to that of Norway. However, since the 90s, oil production in the North Sea has been steadily declining and oil prices are increasingly volatile. In 1999, the British government under Tony Blair's premiership gave Scotland its own parliament and devolved powers as a way of appeasing the nationalists and hoping to stifle the independence movement by giving them a say on things like agriculture, healthcare, and education. Ironically enough, devolution only boosted independence as it gave the SNP a platform where they could voice clearly their desire for independence. In 2011, the SNP won its biggest ever majority in the Scottish Parliament, and in 2014, they were given a vote on Scottish independence. The 2014 Scottish referendum was labelled by the SNP as a once-in-a-generation opportunity, with the highest turnout of any UK democratic vote since universal suffrage, with a turnout of 84%, including 16 and 17-year-olds who were allowed to vote for the referendum. 44% voted yes to independence, whilst 55% voted no. Now, Westminster believed that this would be the end of independence calls for a while, but then Brexit happened. In 2016, 51% of the British electorate voted for Britain to leave the European Union, but in Scotland, 62% voted to remain. Scottish nationalists argued that it was unfair that Scotland should be taken out of the EU, despite most of its electorate voting to remain. Now, the SNP has since called for another referendum, but Westminster refuses to consider it. In 2022, the UK Supreme Court ruled that the Scottish Parliament could not hold another referendum without the approval of Westminster. Today, supporters of independence argue that Scotland should be free to make its own decisions and rejoin the EU free from Westminster. However, Scottish Unionists argue that Scotland benefits economically from remaining in the UK and that independence would create uncertainty around things like trade, public spending and currency. The current British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has ruled out the possibility of another referendum during his premiership, but the SNP continues with calls for another referendum. So what would Scotland look like as an independent nation? And is it truly better off as an independent country or as part of the United Kingdom?